Take her. Take my wife. She's beautiful. Do whatever you want with her. Just don't hurt me. Elena froze, unable to process the words coming out of her husband's mouth. He was cowering in the hallway, offering her to the armed men to save his own skin. But before the Bennetts could touch her, the front door exploded inward, and the crazy hobo neighbor they've been terrified of stepped from the storm with a black dog beside him. You are watching the Jack Graysdale channel. If you love daily stories about life, justice, and redemption, make sure to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. I love reading your comments, so tell me what country or city you're tuning in from today. This story has an incredible twist at the end that you don't want to miss. Let's dive right in. High on the shoulder of a mountain, where the wind spoke in a language older than men, stood a cabin. A collection of dark, weathered logs held together by stubborn will and iron nails, bleeding a thin grey ribbon of smoke into the endless sky. To the handful of souls in the valley below, the cabin was a place you didn't go. And the man who lived there was the reason why. His name was Silas. At least, that's what the name on a faded 30-year-old army discharge paper said. No one had called him that in decades. He was a ghost, a local legend whispered about on stormy nights. They said he'd wrestled a bear and won. They said his face was a road map of 100 knife fights. They said he wasn't a man at all, but something else, something the mountain had made. The truth was less spectacular and far more brutal. Silas was 60 years of ruin and regret, his body a fortress of thick, corded muscle built over a foundation of broken memories. His face was indeed a testament to a violent past. A long, jagged scar ran from his left temple down across his cheek, pulling one corner of his mouth into a permanent, grim sneer. His eyes, the color of a winter sky before a blizzard, held a stillness that was more unsettling than any rage. He stood now in the clearing beside his cabin, the mountain air sharp and cold in his lungs. In his hands he held an axe. He stared at a thick log of seasoned oak, a monster of a thing that would have taken another man half the day to conquer. Silas took a single, deep breath. He didn't grunt or strain, he simply moved. The axe swung in a silent, perfect arc, a silver flash against the dark green of the pines. Crack. The sound was like a rifle shot echoing through the valley. The oak log didn't just split. It exploded, surrendering its heart in two perfect halves. Silas didn't even look at his work. He just set the axe down, his movements economical and precise. And then the shadow moved. From the dark porch of the cabin, a creature emerged. It was not a dog, not in the way people understood the word. It was a beast from a nightmare, a colossal animal the color of coal and midnight. It was a fusion of wolf and mastiff, with the raw power of one and the terrifying size of the other. Its head was massive, its yellow eyes glowing with a feral intelligence. A low, guttural growl rumbled in its chest, a sound like stones grinding together deep within the earth. This was Ghost. The beast padded silently to Silas's side, its shoulder brushing against the old man's leg. Silas placed a scarred, calloused hand on the creature's head, his fingers sinking into the thick, coarse fur. The beast's growl softened into something that might have been a purr, a terrifying, loving sound reserved for only one soul on earth. Man and beast stood together, two solitary kings in a kingdom of rock and silence, perfectly in tune with the wild, untamed world around them. After a moment, Silas turned and walked back inside the cabin. The interior was sparse, clean, and smelled of pine resin and wood smoke. A single bed, a rough-hewn table, a stone fireplace. A life stripped down to its barest essentials. He went to a small carved wooden box on his mantelpiece and opened it. His hands, which had just shattered oak with brutal force, were now impossibly gentle. He lifted out a photograph, its edges soft and worn from 1,000 moments of reverence. It was a picture of a young woman, her hair like spun gold in the sunlight, her eyes full of a life that hadn't yet been wounded. She was laughing, a pure, unburdened sound you could almost hear through the faded paper. In her arms she held a small child, a baby boy wrapped in a blue blanket. Standing beside her was a young man, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulder. He was smiling, his face unscarred, his eyes bright with a future he believed was his to command. It was Silas, but a version of him that had died a long, long time ago. He raised the photograph to his lips, his breath hitching almost imperceptibly, and pressed a kiss to the image of the woman. He then carefully tucked the photo into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, placing it over his heart. A silent promise, a daily ritual of remembrance. The world outside could forget him, but inside this cabin, in the heart of this broken man, she was still alive. It was then that a sound broke the sacred silence, a sound that didn't belong. It was the whine of a high-performance engine, the alien crunch of expensive tires on the gravel of the long-abandoned track that led to the property next door. Silas's head snapped up. Ghost, who had been dozing by the fire, was on his feet in an instant, a low growl vibrating through the floorboards. Silas moved to the small, grimy window and looked out. A vehicle was pulling up to the empty, decaying house that sat 100 yards from his own, a house that had been vacant for 20 years. It wasn't a truck or a beat-up local car. It was a monstrously large, obscenely polished black SUV, gleaming like a wet beetle under the gray sky. It was a machine built for city streets and corporate parking garages, an invader in this world of dirt and trees. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. He was tall, thin, and dressed in clothes that screamed their price tag. A crisp, brand-name polo shirt, tailored chinos, and shoes that had never touched mud. He held a phone clamped to his ear, his voice sharp and loud, slicing through the mountain peace. Leverage. Johnson, it's all about leverage. You tell them the deal is off the table Friday. No exceptions, he barked, not even looking at the majestic vista around him. This was Mark. The passenger door opened, and a woman emerged. She was beautiful, with long, dark hair and a face that could have graced the cover of a magazine. But her beauty was fragile, like a porcelain doll left out in the rain. There was a profound sadness in her eyes, a quiet resignation in the way she moved, as if she were carrying an invisible weight. This was Elena. Then the back door slid open, and a small boy, no older than 5 or 6, scrambled out. He was a whirlwind of energy and innocence, his bright red jacket a splash of vibrant color against the muted greens and browns of the landscape. He looked up at the towering trees and the vast sky with wide, wondrous eyes. This was Leo, the perfect family, a glossy advertisement come to life. Mark finally ended his call, snapping his phone shut. He surveyed his new property, his lip curling in disgust at the overgrown weeds and the peeling paint. His gaze then drifted, landing on Silas's cabin. He saw the wisp of smoke, the stack of perfectly split wood, and then he saw Silas, a shadowy figure in the window. Mark didn't wave. He didn't offer a neighborly nod. His face tightened into a mask of disdain. He saw a dilapidated shack, a dirty old man, and a threat. He turned to his wife, his voice dripping with condescension. Great. Just what we needed. Some backwoods hillbilly for a neighbor, he muttered, loud enough for the wind to carry. Elena followed his gaze and saw Silas's silhouette. She didn't see a hillbilly. She saw a stillness, a loneliness that echoed something deep inside her own soul. For a fleeting moment, her sad eyes met the darkness of the window, and she felt a strange, inexplicable pull. But Mark was already grabbing their bags from the trunk, his movements impatient and proprietary. Come on, let's get this stuff inside. I'll deal with that later. Silas watched them go inside. He watched the polished man, the broken woman, and the innocent child. He felt the old, familiar piece of his solitude beginning to crack. His hand went instinctively to his chest, to the photograph tucked safely in his pocket. The storm wasn't in the sky yet, but he could feel it coming. The first morning broke not with the gentle song of mountain birds, but with the aggressive thwip, thwip, thwip of high-pressure sprinklers. Mark had been busy. Overnight, it seemed, he had declared war on the wilderness. The wild, unruly patch of land that separated his pristine rental from Silas's domain was now being systematically tamed, drowned under a fine, artificial mist. He stood on his perfectly manicured lawn, a square of fluorescent green turf he must have had trucked in, wearing a sweat-wicking athletic shirt and shorts, a phone once again pressed to his ear. He wasn't talking business. He was complaining. No, I'm telling you, the coverage is spotty. I'm paying for premium satellite. I expect premium results. He snapped into the device. He paced back and forth, a caged animal in a yard he owned but did not belong to. Silas watched from his porch. He sat in a weathered rocking chair, a solid block of cedar in his lap and a knife in his hand. It wasn't a small whittling knife. It was a draw knife, a brutal-looking tool with a long, curved blade and a wooden handle at each end. To a man like Mark, it would look like a weapon from a medieval torture chamber. To Silas, it was an artist's brush. He drew the blade towards him, and a long, fragrant curl of wood peeled away from the block, falling silently to the floor. The sound it made was a soft, satisfying shh, the polar opposite of the hiss and spit of Mark's sprinklers. Mark finally ended his call, sighing with theatrical frustration. His eyes, sweeping his new kingdom, inevitably fell upon the property line, and upon Silas. He stopped pacing. His posture stiffened. His face, which was already a mask of petty annoyance, curdled into one of pure disgust. He saw the scarred face, the powerful shoulders, the glint of steel. He didn't see an old man carving wood. He saw a threat, a human-shaped problem that was ruining his view and lowering his property value. Silas met his gaze. He didn't smile, didn't nod. He simply held the man's stare, his own eyes as flat and unreadable as river stones. He drew the knife again. Another perfect curl of cedar dropped to the porch. The message was clear. This is my world. You are the intruder. Mark, unaccustomed to being ignored or challenged, puffed out his chest. But before he could shout some new indignity, a shadow detached itself from Silas's cabin. Ghost padded into the morning light, his massive form a moving piece of the dark mountain itself. He didn't bark. He didn't run. He walked with a slow, deliberate gait to the edge of Silas's property, stopping at the flimsy, rusted wire fence that separated the two worlds. He stood there, silent and immense, his yellow eyes fixed on Mark. He was not a dog asking to be petted. He was a guardian on his wall. Mark took an involuntary step back. The bravado drained from his face, replaced by a flash of primal fear. This wasn't a poodle from the suburbs. This was a monster, a wolf, a demon. A low growl started deep in Ghost's chest. It wasn't loud, but it vibrated in the air, a sound of geological pressure, of tectonic plates shifting. It was a warning that spoke a language older than words. At that moment, Elena and little Leo came out onto their own porch. Leo, a ball of pure morning energy, saw the giant doggy and his face lit up with innocent delight. "Look, Mama, a wolf," he chirped, taking a step forward. Mark's fear instantly metastasized into rage. He whirled around, his face a contorted mess of fury. "Leo, get back here, now," he shrieked, his voice unnaturally high. "Elena, what is wrong with you? Get him inside. Do you want him to get his face ripped off by that thing?" Leo froze, his smile vanishing, his eyes welling with tears at the violence in his father's tone. Elena flinched as if struck. She quickly scooped the boy into her arms, murmuring reassurances, her movements hurried and submissive. She cast a brief, haunted look across the yard, a look that was a silent apology, a plea, a confession of her own helplessness. It lingered on Silas for a fraction of a second, a spark of connection across a gulf of fear, before she turned and disappeared back inside the house, a prisoner retreating to her cell. His audience gone, Mark focused his full, impotent fury on Silas. "You, psycho," he screamed, pointing a trembling finger. "You keep that monster of yours on a leash, you hear me? This is a respectable place now. We have a child. I see that thing near this fence again. I'm calling the pound to have it put down. And I'll have you thrown out of here, you filthy hobo." Silas didn't move. The rocking chair didn't stop its slow, rhythmic creak. He just watched the smaller man unravel, watched the fear behind the bluster. He placed the draw knife down, picked up a smaller, finer blade, and began to carve a detail into the wood. He was shaping a wolf's head, its lines noble and fierce. He gave it dignity. He gave it a soul. Everything the man shouting at him lacked. Mark, receiving no reaction, sputtered into silence. He was a man who thrived on intimidation, on seeing others shrink before him. Silas's calm was more infuriating than any counter-threat. Defeated and humiliated by a silent old man, Mark stormed back to his house, slamming the door so hard the frame shuddered. The next few days were a campaign of escalation. The war of attrition began. A truck arrived, not with furniture, but with a team of technicians. They began installing a new fence. Not a quaint wooden one, but a towering 8-foot-tall privacy fence made of sterile gray composite material. It was a wall. A monolithic declaration of separation. The rusted wire that had stood for 50 years was ripped out and discarded like a withered vine. Then came the cameras. Small black domes of surveillance appeared under the eaves of Mark's house, their dark lenses all pointed toward Silas's property. They were cold, unblinking eyes, designed to watch, to record, to judge. Mark was building a fortress, not against the wild animals of the mountain, but against the one old man and his dog who lived there. Silas watched it all. He watched the workmen erect the plastic wall, section by sterile section, erasing the horizon, blocking the view of the valley he had known for 30 years. He felt the world shrinking, the invisible cage around him becoming a physical one. He heard Mark boasting on the phone to someone, his voice carrying on the wind. "Yeah, putting up a proper fence. Can't be too careful. The neighbor is some kind of vagrant, a real creep. Probably cooks meth in that shack. But don't worry, I'm creating a safe zone. I'll have this whole place civilized in no time. A safe zone. Civilized. The words were poison. This mountain, in all its raw and brutal honesty, was the safest place Silas had ever known. And this man, with his expensive lies and his sterile walls, was the most dangerous creature to set foot on it in years. That evening, as the last rays of sun bled out behind the peaks, the wall was complete. It stood between the two homes, ugly and absolute. On one side, the manicured lawn, the bright lights of the designer house, the silent watching cameras. On the other, the dark cabin, the scent of pine, the quiet dignity of a man carving a wolf from a block of wood, and a beast who understood the difference between a monster and a man. The gray plastic reflected the dying light. It was a scar on the landscape, a monument to fear and arrogance, and as Silas looked at it, he felt a cold certainty settle in his bones. The wall wasn't there to keep him out. It was there to trap them in. And the real beasts were already inside. The wall changed the air. It held the heat in, creating a stifling, silent bubble around Mark's perfect house. The wind, which used to whisper through the pines and carry the scent of damp earth and distant rain, now hit the gray barrier and died. On one side of the wall, There was life. On the other, there was a lifestyle. Mark embraced it. He treated his pristine lawn like a private country club. Mornings were for his golf swing, the thwack of the club hitting the ball echoing unnaturally in the enclosed space. He'd send a dozen white balls sailing into a portable net, his form practiced and aggressive, a pantomime of power. Afternoons were for business. He'd pace the stone patio, a Bluetooth device blinking in his ear like a malevolent insect, his voice a percussive assault on the mountain's quiet. Leverage the asset. Crush the competition. I don't pay you to think, I pay you to execute. He was a warlord commanding his armies from a remote, sterile bunker. Elena drifted through this new reality like a ghost. She moved from the designer kitchen to the sun-drenched living room, her beauty a fragile ornament in a house that felt more like a showroom than a home. She spoke little, her eyes often fixed on the towering gray fence, as if she could see through it to the wild, breathing world that had been stolen from her. And then there was Leo. A child's world is measured not in square feet, but in wonders. And his new world was wonderless. He had a swing set that was safety inspected to within an inch of its life, a sandbox filled with sterile white sand, and a collection of expensive electronic toys that beeped and flashed with a soulless energy. But he had no dirt to dig in, no strange bugs to discover, no woods to get lost in. He was a prisoner in paradise. His father's booming voice was the soundtrack to his days, a constant, irritating hum of adult anger. While Mark was on the phone screaming about quarterly reports, Leo was on his knees at the edge of the lawn, listlessly pushing a toy truck through the unnaturally green blades of grass. He was bored. A deep, soul-crushing boredom that only a 6-year-old with the universe inside him and nowhere to put it can feel. His eyes were drawn, again and again, to the wall. It was the most interesting thing in the yard. It was a boundary. It was a mystery. Pushing his truck aside, he went to it, running his small hand along its smooth, warm surface. It felt fake, like the plastic of his toys. He followed it around the perimeter of his cage, a tiny warden inspecting the bars. And that's when he found it. Near the back, hidden behind a meticulously trimmed azalea bush, the installers had made a mistake. The ground here dipped unexpectedly, and the bottom of one of the composite panels didn't quite meet the earth. There was a gap, a crescent-shaped smile of dark, rich soil and tangled roots no wider than his hand. It was a flaw in the perfection. It was an escape hatch. He dropped to his belly, the manicured grass cool against his cheek, and peered through. The world on the other side was a dizzying kaleidoscope of green and brown. He could see the base of a giant pine tree, its bark cracked and ancient. He could smell the sharp, clean scent of pine needles. He could see a single, massive black paw resting motionless in a patch of sunlight. His heart gave a little thump of excitement. The monster. A few days later, the routine was the same. Mark was on the patio closing a deal. Elena was inside arranging flowers that had been delivered in a box. Leo was sitting on the back step with his lunch. His mother had made him his favorite, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, cut into triangles with the crust removed, served with a side of apple slices. He ate one triangle dutifully, then another. The third he held in his hand. He heard a soft sound from the other side of the wall. A heavy sigh, the sound of a large body settling into the dirt. He knew who it was. On impulse, driven by a pure, childish logic that knows no fear, he slid off the step, sandwich in hand, and crawled to the gap behind the azalea bush. He lay on his stomach and peeked through. A single, luminous yellow eye stared back. It wasn't angry. It wasn't menacing. It was just watching, waiting. Ghost was lying there, his enormous head resting on his paws, a silent black sphinx guarding a forgotten world. Leo's heart beat faster now, but it was with anticipation, not fear. He broke off a corner of his sandwich, a sticky, gooey lump of white bread and peanut butter. His hand trembled slightly as he pushed it through the gap. He offered it into the unknown. From his window, Silas saw the whole thing. He had been carving, his hand shaping a block of basswood into a soaring eagle, but his work had slowed. He found himself watching the boy more and more these days, a sad, silent observer of a life under glass. He saw the child crawl towards the fence, and his first instinct was a protective surge of alarm. But then he saw the sandwich, he saw the small, outstretched hand, and he stopped. His hands holding the knife and the half-carved bird became still. He held his breath. On the other side of the fence, Ghost lifted his massive head. His nostrils flared, taking in the scent of processed flour and sweetened peanuts. He looked from the offered food to the small fingers holding it. A low rumble started in his chest, and for a terrifying second, Silas thought Mark was right, that the wildness in the beast would take over. But the rumble softened into something that was almost a purr. Ghost leaned forward. His movement was impossibly delicate for a creature his size. He didn't snap. He didn't snatch. He opened his great jaws, and with the very front of his teeth, he lifted the piece of sandwich from the boy's fingers as gently as a mother lifts a pup. He swallowed it in one gulp. Leo giggled, a pure, tinkling sound that seemed to make the air shimmer. He was delighted. Emboldened, he pushed the rest of the sandwich triangle through the hole. "You like it?" he whispered. "Mama makes the best." Ghost ate the second piece just as gently, and then he did something that made the old man's heart crack clean in two. The beast pushed his wet black nose through the gap and licked the boy's fingers, cleaning away the last sticky traces of jelly. His tongue was warm and rough, a startlingly intimate touch that bridged two worlds. Leo squealed with joy, pulling his hand back and wiping it on his jeans. "You're a good doggy," he whispered. "You're a good wolf." Inside the cabin, Silas lowered himself into his chair. The eagle carving slipped from his grasp and fell to the floor with a soft clatter. He didn't notice. He closed his eyes, and an image flooded his mind, sharp and painful and beautiful. A sun-drenched afternoon, 30 years ago. A young woman with laughing eyes, his wife, sitting on a blanket. A small child, his child, squealing with delight as a clumsy, flop-eared puppy licked ice cream from his fingers. The memory was so vivid it was a physical blow, a phantom limb aching with a loss so profound it had shaped every day since. A single tear escaped from under his scarred eyelid and traced a path through the deep lines of his face. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall. The child's laughter from outside was an echo from a life he thought was buried forever. That evening, long after the lights in Mark's house had been switched on and the artificial world was sealed away for the night, Silas walked out to the fence. The air was cool and smelled of coming rain. He knelt, his old knees cracking in protest, and looked through the small opening. He saw the perfect lawn, the empty swing set, the dark windows. It was a postcard from a sad, lonely planet. He reached into the deep pocket of his canvas jacket and pulled out a small object. It was a wolf, carved from a single piece of pale, smooth pine. He had spent the afternoon working on it, his hands moving with a renewed purpose. Every line was perfect. The proud set of the head, the intelligent eyes, the powerful line of the back. It wasn't a monster. It was a guardian, a protector. It was Ghost, immortalized in wood. He reached through the gap, his large, calloused hand entering the forbidden territory. He placed the small wooden wolf carefully on the grass, just on the other side of the fence, where the boy would be sure to find it. It sat there on the fluorescent green lawn, a small, wild, honest thing in a world of expensive lies. It was a message, a thank you. It was a secret passed from one lonely soul to another, through a crack in a wall built of fear. The small wooden wolf was no longer a piece of wood. In Leo's hands, it was a king. It was the protector of the silent green kingdom, the guardian of the azalea bush, the silent, noble brother of the great black beast who lived on the other side of the world. He lay on his stomach in the perfect grass, the sun warm on his back, and pushed the wolf through the blades as if it were a dense forest. "You must be quiet, King Ghost," he whispered, his voice a conspiratorial hiss. "The bad men are coming. They want to steal the sun." The wolf stood proud and motionless, its carved wooden eyes staring bravely into the imaginary darkness. Leo made a low, growling sound in his throat, a child's imitation of the real ghost's rumbling purr. He was lost. He was in a story where he was safe, where his friends were powerful, and where the world was a grand adventure, not a manicured cage. He didn't hear the sliding glass door open. He didn't hear the soft, expensive thud of leather loafers on the stone patio. "What is that?" The voice shattered the illusion. It was sharp, cold, and laced with the impatient annoyance that Mark reserved for slow waiters and incompetent subordinates. Leo flinched, instinctively hiding the wolf behind his back. Mark stood over him, a titan in a polo shirt, his shadow blotting out the sun. His eyes weren't on Leo, but on the object in his son's hand. "I said, what is that piece of junk? Let me see it." Leo's lower lip trembled. He shook his head. "It's mine. Nothing is yours unless I buy it for you," Mark snapped, his patience, always a shallow reservoir, completely drained. He bent down, his knees cracking in protest, and snatched the wolf from Leo's grasp with a startling lack of care. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a dead insect. He scrutinized the smooth lines, the carefully etched fur, the intelligent shape of the head. It was clearly handmade, crude, filthy, the work of a poor person. A shiver of pure revulsion went through him. This was contamination, an alien object in a sterile world. "Where," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "did you get this?" Tears welled in Leo's eyes. He pointed a trembling finger, not at the gap in the fence, but at the whole imposing structure, towards the dark woods and the wisp of smoke rising from the unseen cabin. The man," he stammered. "The man with the big doggy." It was like throwing a match into a barrel of gasoline. The vague suspicion Mark had harbored, the simmering resentment he felt for his neighbor, exploded into white-hot, righteous fury. Every paranoid fantasy he'd entertained suddenly seemed like a prophecy. The freak, the psycho. He wasn't just an eyesore. He was a predator, luring his son, grooming him, passing this dirty, splintered talisman through the fence like some kind of backwoods curse. "Elena!" he roared, spinning on his heel. His face was a mask of crimson rage. Elena appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on an apron, her face etched with a familiar weary dread. She saw the wooden toy in his hand and the terror on Leo's face, and she understood instantly. "Mark, please, don't," she began. "Don't? Don't you see what's happening?" He shoved the wooden wolf towards her face. "Your son is taking gifts from the homeless lunatic next door. What's next? Candy?" A quick peek into his filthy shack. "Do I have to do everything? Do I have to be the only one who cares about the safety of this family?" He turned back to Leo, who was now openly sobbing. "You never, ever go near that fence again. You never talk to him. Do you understand me? He is a bad, dirty man." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and marched towards the gate at the side of the house, the small wooden wolf clenched in his fist so tightly he could feel the carved ears digging into his palm. He was a man possessed by a holy mission. He was going to put a stop to this. He was going to lay down the law. He was going to teach this vagrant a lesson about property lines and the natural order of things. The air on the other side of his fence felt different, wilder. It smelled of wood smoke and pine rot. The ground was uneven, littered with rocks and roots. Mark's expensive loafers, designed for country club patios, struggled for purchase. He stomped through the undergrowth, his fury propelling him forward until he broke through into the clearing where Silas's cabin stood. The old man was there, by a massive chopping block. His back was to Mark. His faded flannel shirt was stretched taut across a formidable expanse of muscle. He raised a heavy splitting axe high over his head, held it there for a perfect, still moment, and brought it down. Crack! A thick log fell apart in two perfect halves. The sound echoed with finality. Without turning, Silas bent down, set another log on the block, and straightened up. He still hadn't acknowledged Mark's presence. This infuriated Mark even more, the sheer arrogance of the man. To ignore him, to stand there like some kind of primitive king in his squalid kingdom of dirt and rust. "Hey, you!" Mark shouted, his voice shrill. "I'm talking to you, freak." Silas finished his swing. Another log split with a deafening crack. Only then did he slowly, deliberately, place the axe head down in the chopping block and turn around. His face was a roadmap of hard miles, the scars pile against his weathered skin. His eyes were like chips of granite, ancient and unreadable. They held no fear. They held no anger. They simply watched. Mark strode forward until he was just a few feet away, invading the old man's space. He thrust his hand out, opening his fist to reveal the small wooden wolf. "What the hell is this? You giving my son trinkets? Trying to lure him over here? What kind of sick game are you playing?" Silas's eyes flickered down to the carving, then back up to Mark's face. He remained silent. His silence was 1,000 times more infuriating than any argument could have been. "Don't you play dumb with me," Mark spat, his voice trembling with rage. "I know your type. Living out here in the filth, preying on good, decent families. Well, it's over. You stay away from my son. You stay away from my property. You so much as look at my family again, and I'll make one phone call. One call, and a man with a van will come for that rabid mutt of yours, and they won't be taking it to a farm. They'll put a needle in it. And then I'll call the cops. I'll tell them how you're trying to entice a child. They'll bury you so far back in a cell you'll forget what the sun looks like." He was screaming now, flecks of spittle flying from his lips. He was high on his own power, on his own righteous anger. He needed a reaction. He needed to see fear in the old man's eyes. He saw nothing. "Do you hear me?" Mark shrieked. He took the wooden wolf and, with a flick of his wrist, threw it at Silas's chest. It hit the flannel shirt with a pathetic thud and fell into the dirt. "That's what I think of your trash." Still, Silas didn't move. He didn't even look down at the fallen carving. He just stood there, his massive, scarred hands hanging loose at his sides. For Mark, it was the final insult. This was defiance. He had to break him. He had to make him understand who was in charge. With a guttural roar of frustration, Mark lunged forward and shoved Silas hard with both hands against his chest. It was like pushing against a granite cliff face. Silas didn't move. He didn't stumble. He didn't even rock back on his heels. The force of Mark's shove seemed to vanish into him, absorbed by a density and stillness that was not human. He simply stood there, an immovable object. For the first time, a flicker of something other than contempt appeared in Mark's eyes. It was confusion, quickly followed by a primal knot of fear. He had just put his hands on this man, this mountain, and nothing had happened. And then something did happen. From the side of the cabin where Ghost had been lying in the dirt, there came a sound. It began as a low growl, a vibration that seemed to come from the center of the earth. It wasn't the sound of a dog. It was the sound of a furnace igniting. The beast rose to his feet, not with a jump, but with a fluid, terrifying unfolding of muscle and bone. The heavy logging chain that tethered him to an iron stake in the ground went taut, the thick metal links groaning under the sudden strain. Ghost's lips peeled back from his teeth, revealing gums as black as tar and fangs the color and size of old ivory daggers. The growl deepened into a chest-rattling roar of pure possessive fury. He saw the threat to his master. He saw the man who had laid hands on his entire world, and he lunged. The chain snapped. The sound was like a rifle shot. The thick metal link, designed to tow fallen trees, sheared apart in a shower of metallic sparks. For a split second, an impossible tableau was frozen in time. The immovable old man, the terrified suburbanite, and 150 pounds of black-furred rage launching itself through the air, a living missile of teeth and claws. Mark's carefully constructed world of power and control evaporated in a single, heart-stopping instant. The rage on his face dissolved into a mask of pure, abject terror. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He let out a high-pitched feminine shriek that was swallowed by the monster's roar. Ghost landed silently, not on Mark, but directly in front of Silas, planting his massive paws in the dirt, forming a living wall of protective fury. He stood there, hackles raised, chest heaving, a continuous murderous snarl ripping from his throat. He was no longer a dog. He was a force of nature. Mark scrambled backward, his loafers slipping in the mud. He tripped over a tree root and fell hard, landing in a heap of designer clothing in undignified panic. He crab-walked away, pushing himself with his hands, his eyes wide with horror, never breaking contact with the nightmare beast in front of him. He got to his feet and ran. He fled, stumbling and gasping, back through the trees, a pathetic, terrified creature bolting for the safety of its cage. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the heavy panting of the dog. Silas slowly lowered his gaze from the retreating figure of his neighbor. He looked down at Ghost, whose rage was already subsiding into low, watchful growls. He placed a heavy, calloused hand on the beast's massive head, and the growling stopped. Then he bent down, his knees cracking, and picked up the small wooden wolf from the dirt. He brushed it off with his thumb, his touch infinitely gentle. He stood up and looked towards the other house. Through the trees he could see Elena. She was standing at her gate, her hand pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide. She hadn't run. She had watched it all. As their eyes met across the divide, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It was an apology and an acknowledgement. An understanding had passed between them, silent and profound, through a wall built of fear. The wind came first. It was not a gentle summer breeze that rustled the leaves into a soft whisper. This was a different kind of wind. It was a thief, stealing the warmth from the air, carrying the metallic scent of distant rain in a low, ominous hum. The sky, once a brilliant, cloudless blue, began to curdle at the edges, turning the color of a day-old bruise. The perfect, manicured world Mark had built for himself was about to be violated by something he couldn't bully, buy, or sue. Inside the glass and steel monument to his success, the television flickered. A local news anchor, her face a mask of practiced seriousness, was speaking. Mark barely paid attention. He was pacing the living room, a Bluetooth headset perched on his ear, berating some unfortunate soul on the other end of the line. "I don't care about supply chains, Johnson. I care about results. Make it happen or I'll find someone who will." He clicked the call off, exhaling with the satisfaction of a king who had just ordered an execution. Elena was watching the television, her hands clasped in her lap. She felt the change in the air pressure deep in her bones, an old primal anxiety that her husband's modern fortress couldn't dispel. "And we are upgrading this to a severe thunderstorm warning for the entire valley," the anchor said, her voice cutting through the sterile silence of the room. "We're expecting winds of up to 70 miles per hour and the possibility of flash flooding. Residents in low-lying areas are advised to seek higher ground immediately. All roads leading in and out of the valley may become impassable." "Pathetic," Mark muttered, pouring himself a glass of whiskey that cost more than most people's weekly groceries. 50 grand for a generator, and this place is more secure than Fort Knox. Let the storm come. But the anchor wasn't finished. Her expression grew even more somber. "We have breaking news on another urgent matter. State police have confirmed that 3 inmates have escaped from the Black Creek Maximum Security Facility. The escapees are identified as members of the notorious Skull Gang, considered armed and extremely dangerous. 3 mugshots filled the screen. They were hard men with dead eyes and tattoos that crawled up their necks like venomous vines. The kind of men who existed only in nightmares and on screens like this one. Officials believe they may be heading east, using the cover of the approaching storm to evade capture. Residents are urged to lock their doors, secure their homes, and report any suspicious activity immediately." A knot of ice formed in Elena's stomach. She looked out the vast picture window at the darkening woods, at the lone wisp of smoke rising from Silas's chimney. They weren't in the city anymore. Help wasn't a block away. They were isolated. They were alone. "Mark," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you hear that?" "I heard it," he scoffed, swirling his drink. "A bunch of lowlifes. They won't get within a mile of this place. We have cameras, we have locks, we have a gate. This isn't some shack in the woods." He cast a pointed, contemptuous glance towards Silas's property. The first crack of thunder was a cosmic whip snapping across the sky. It was not a distant rumble, it was a physical blow that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the windows in their frames. Leo, who had been playing quietly in the corner, let out a small cry and ran to his mother. And then, as if the world itself had given up, the power died. It wasn't a flicker, it was an amputation. The television screen collapsed into a single white dot and vanished. The soft hum of the air conditioning, the gentle glow of the recessed lighting, the digital clock on the oven, all of it was gone. The silence that rushed in was deafening, absolute. The only light was the cold, gray twilight filtering through the windows, now streaked with the first heavy drops of rain. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, the emergency generator deep in the basement coughed, sputtered, and failed to engage. Damn it, Mark's voice was a harsh tear in the fabric of the dark. Useless piece of junk. I paid top dollar for that system. I'll have their heads for this. He fumbled for his phone, its screen a blinding rectangle of light. No signal, of course. Perfect. The storm broke in earnest. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid sheets. A vertical river intent on drowning the world. The wind screamed, a banshee howling for entry. Lightning flashed, bleaching the world white for a split second, followed by thunder so immediate and violent it felt like the mountains themselves were cracking apart. In Siles's cabin, the world went dark too, but the silence was familiar. He was sitting in his worn armchair, the small wooden wolf resting on the table beside him. A single candle flame danced in the gloom, casting long, distorted shadows that writhed on the rough-hewn walls. His old, battery-powered radio, a relic from another era, had crackled out the same warnings about the storm and the escapees. He had listened, his expression unchanging. He had heard news like this before, in places far more dangerous than this quiet valley. He got up, the floorboards groaning under his weight, and slid a heavy iron bolt across his door. It settled into place with a solid, satisfying thunk. Ghost, lying by the cold hearth, lifted his massive head, a low growl vibrating in his chest. He sensed the storm, but his ears were also tuned to something else, something human. Silas placed a hand on his head. Easy, boy, we wait. Back in the glass house, fear was a cold, creeping thing. Elena had found a flashlight. In its narrow, trembling beam, she led Leo upstairs to his bedroom. The boy was shaking, his face buried in her side. His room, usually a bright and cheerful space, was now a cave filled with terrifying shapes and shadows. It's okay, my love, Elena murmured, pulling back the covers of his bed. It's just a little storm. It will be over soon. She tucked him in, but he clung to her hand. Sing me the song, Mommy. The wolf song. Elena smiled, a sad, gentle curve of her lips in the darkness. She sat on the edge of his bed, the flashlight beam pointed at the ceiling, and began to sing. Her voice was soft, a fragile thread of warmth against the raging symphony of the storm. The mountain sleeps, my little one. The river runs to home. The shadow wolf will guard your dreams, so you are not alone. It was a song her own mother had sung to her, a lullaby passed down from a past she barely knew. It was the only thing she had left of her father, the man her mother had called a hero, the man who vanished before she could form a single memory of his face. As she sang, her free hand went to her neck, her fingers closing around the object that always rested there, hidden beneath her shirt. It was a medallion, not a delicate piece of modern jewelry, but something heavy, old. It was made of tarnished silver, thick and cool to the touch. It was circular, its edges worn smooth by time, and on its surface was a deeply etched, intricate carving of a snarling wolf's head. It was strange, almost barbaric, a relic that didn't belong in her world of clean lines and passive beauty. It was a secret, a question mark she wore against her heart. It was all that remained of the father she never met. The thunder rolls, the wild winds blow, but you are safe and sound, for the wolf is king of all this land and watches all around. Leo's breathing began to even out, his fear soothed by the ancient melody. Outside, a flash of lightning illuminated the room, and for a second, the silver wolf on the medallion in Elena's hand seemed to gleam with a life of its own. In that same flash, miles away, Silas looked at the faded photograph of the woman with the child, her voice echoing in his memory, singing the exact same words. Downstairs, Mark had managed to light a few decorative candles. He stood by the window, a dark silhouette against the strobing, violent night. He was not thinking of his family's safety. He was thinking about the money he had lost on the generator, the incompetence of the signal provider, the sheer inconvenience of it all. He was a man trapped in a cage of his own making, and the bars were beginning to rattle. He didn't see them at first. The rain was too thick, the darkness too complete. Then a bolt of lightning split the sky, illuminating the entire property for 3 long, terrifying seconds. In that stark, unnatural light, Mark saw them, 3 figures in black, moving with a predator's purpose through the lashing rain, not towards the road but directly towards his house. They were not shadows. They were the men from the television. When the world snapped back into darkness, The storm found a new note. It wasn't thunder this time, but the sharp, crystalline shriek of heavy glass giving way somewhere on the far side of the house, followed by the tinkling cascade of shards across marble, the sound of his sealed world being physically broken. For a moment, Mark was paralyzed. His entire life was built on control, on insulating himself from the chaos of the outside world with money, with technology, with walls. And a wall had just been breached. The decorative candles flickered, their weak light throwing his terrified shadow, long and distorted, against the wall behind him. The storm howled, as if in approval. He could hear footsteps now, heavy, unhurried. The crunch of broken glass under thick-soled boots. He grabbed the heaviest thing he could find, a bronze sculpture of a bull he bought at an auction, a symbol of market dominance. It felt pathetic and cold in his trembling hands. 3 figures emerged from the hallway, stepping into the living room like wraiths born from the storm. They were massive, draped in black rain-slick gear that shed water onto the pristine white rug, creating dark, spreading stains. The air they brought with them was frigid, smelling of wet earth, stale cigarette smoke, and something else, something metallic and predatory. They were the men from the television, the Skull Gang. The one in the lead was the biggest. A thick, ugly tattoo of a cracked skull snaked out from the collar of his jacket and crawled up his neck, disappearing into a shorn, stubbled hairline. His eyes, small and dark, scanned the opulent room with a look of bored contempt. He saw the expensive art, the minimalist furniture, the man holding a tiny bronze bowl, and he smiled. It was a slow, cruel stretching of the lips that held no humor at all. "Nice place," the leader grunted, his voice a gravelly rasp. The other 2 fanned out, their movements practiced, professional. One carried a crowbar, the other was idly flipping a long, wicked-looking knife. Mark's mind, usually a sharp instrument of corporate warfare, was a frantic mess. His usual weapons threats, lawyers, status were useless here. Still, habit died hard. "Get out," he said, his voice a squeak he barely recognized. He cleared his throat and tried again, forcing authority into his tone. "Get out of my house. I've already triggered a silent alarm. The police are on their way." The leader chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "An alarm? In this storm? With the power out? Buddy, God himself doesn't know we're here." He took a step forward, and Mark flinched back. "We saw the news. Know who you are. Mark Stratton, big shot CEO. We figure a guy like you has a safe. We want what's in it. Cash, jewelry, whatever you rich folks keep lying around. Be quick, and maybe we won't have to break all your pretty toys." Mark's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He thought of the safe in his office, hidden behind a ridiculously expensive painting. He thought of the cash, the watches, the bearer bonds, his money, his things. You can't," he stammered. "I'll give you anything. Just don't touch anything." The man with the knife laughed out loud. "He says, 'Don't touch anything,'" he mocked. To prove his point, he casually swiped the knife across the back of a leather armchair, leaving a deep, gaping wound in the hide. Rage, hot and impotent, flared in Mark's chest. That chair cost $12,000. This violation was worse than the broken window. It was personal. But the rage was instantly extinguished by a tidal wave of fear as the leader closed the distance between them. He didn't even bother to raise his voice. He just loomed over Mark, radiating a quiet, brutal menace that was more terrifying than any shout. "Are you listening to me?" the leader whispered. "We're not here to negotiate." It was then that another sound cut through the room. A soft creak from the top of the grand sweeping staircase. All 4 men looked up. There, at the top of the stairs, stood Elena. She was holding the flashlight, its beam trembling, creating a halo of pale, ghostly light around her. Behind her, clutching her leg, his small face a mask of confusion and terror, was Leo. They had been woken by the sound of the breaking glass, by the strange, deep voices. The leader's dead smile returned, wider this time. His gaze shifted from Mark to Elena, and something in his eyes changed. It was a cold, appraising look, the way a wolf looks at a lamb. "Well, well," he purred. "Look what we have here, a family." In that moment, a switch flipped in Mark's brain. The complex wiring of a husband and father short-circuited, overridden by a single primal instinct, self-preservation. He saw his wife and son not as precious lives to be defended, but as liabilities, distractions. And then a darker thought blossomed in the fertile soil of his terror. They were leverage, a shield. Elena started down the stairs, her movements slow, deliberate. "Please," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "please, just take what you want and leave us alone. Don't hurt my son." The bandits watched her, enjoying the spectacle. They were in complete control. Mark saw his chance. His mind, the same one that navigated hostile takeovers and dismantled competitors, saw the escape route. It wasn't a path of heroism. It was a crawl space of cowardice. He lowered the ridiculous bronze bowl, placing it gently on the floor as if it were a holy relic. He raised his hands in a gesture of absolute surrender. The leader's eyes narrowed, shifting back to Mark. Smart man. Yes, Mark breathed, his voice a wet, pleading whisper. Yes, very smart. Look, I'll give you everything. The safe is upstairs. In my office, I'll open it for you. It's all yours. He began to back away, not towards the intruders, but sideways, towards the hallway that led to the reinforced basement pantry, his so-called panic room. The man with the crowbar took a step to block him. Not so fast. Mark panicked. He looked from the cold-eyed bandits to his wife, now halfway down the stairs, a fragile beacon of defiance in the oppressive darkness. He saw her beauty, her strength, and he saw it as his final bargaining chip. His finger, shaking, rose from his side. It was a trembling, white accusation, pointing directly at Elena. Take it all, he shrieked, his voice cracking, dissolving into a pathetic whine. Take the watches, the money, take her. She's beautiful, isn't she? Do whatever you want. Just don't hurt me. The world stopped. The storm outside seemed to hold its breath. The candle flames froze. The only thing that moved was the look of utter, soul-shattering disbelief on Elena's face. It was a look of horror not at the bandits, but at the man she had married. The father of her child. The leader of the Skull Gang actually took a step back, a flicker of genuine surprise in his dead eyes. He had seen a lot of ugly things in his life, but this was a new level of pathetic. A small, disgusted sneer curled his lip. Mark didn't wait for a response. He didn't wait for their judgment or his wife's tears. He turned and scrambled. He didn't run. He scurried away like a rat, crab walking backwards, his eyes wide with animal terror. He fumbled his way down the hall, slammed the heavy, steel-reinforced door of the panic room, and they all heard the sound of 3 heavy deadbolts sliding into place. A series of metallic, definitive thuds. A tomb sealing itself from the inside. Silence descended upon the living room, broken only by the roar of the wind and the soft, heartbroken sob that escaped Elena's lips. She stood frozen on the stairs, the flashlight beam now pointed at the floor, illuminating a small circle of her own helplessness. Leo buried his face deeper into her leg, his small body trembling violently. She was alone. They were completely, utterly alone. The leader of the bandits slowly turned his head from the sealed door back to her. The surprise on his face was gone, replaced by that same cold, predatory smile. He and his men began to advance towards the staircase, the heavy boots silent now on the expensive rug. They moved with a new kind of confidence, the kind that comes from knowing there is no one left to fight back. Well, the leader said, his voice dropping to a low, conversational tone that was more chilling than any yell. It seems your husband has left us to get acquainted. He took the final step to the bottom of the stairs and looked up at her, the knife-wielding man flanking him on one side, the crowbar on the other. They were a wall of inevitable violence. Let's start, he said, his smile widening, with that pretty necklace you're wearing. The man with the knife idly scraped its tip against the polished wood of the banister, carving a thin white scar. Elena's heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The staircase was a trap, leading up into darkness, into a dead end. She took one step back, pulling Leo with her. Please, she whispered, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. There's a safe in the office. Upstairs. End of the hall. He kept cash there. Watches. Just take it. The leader smiled that dead, humorless smile. He placed a heavy boot on the first step. The old wood groaned under his weight. Oh, we'll get to that. All in good time. He ascended another step, then another. But first, a little introduction. He was close now. So close she could smell the damp wool of his jacket and the stale cigarette smoke on his breath. He reached out, not with aggression, but with a horrifying, casual entitlement. His thick, calloused fingers brushed against her throat, and she flinched as if struck by a snake. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at the strange, old-fashioned silver medallion that rested in the hollow of her throat. That's pretty, he grunted. With a single sharp tug, he ripped the chain from her neck. The delicate silver links bit into her skin before snapping. She gasped, less from the pain and more from the violation. The medallion was the last piece she had of her mother, the only link to a father she'd never known. He held it in his palm, studying it for a moment under the flickering candlelight before closing his fist around it and pocketing it. A down payment. The other two took that as their cue. The one with the crowbar moved past them up the stairs, heading towards the office she'd pointed out. The one with the knife stayed, his eyes fixated on her hands. He pointed at the simple gold band on her left ring finger. That too, he ordered. Her hands trembled as she tried to work the ring over her knuckle. It was tight. Years of a comfortable life had made it so. The irony was a bitter pill. The symbol of the union with the man now cowering behind a steel door refused to leave her. The bandit grew impatient. He grabbed her hand, his grip like a vice. I said, give it to me. He began to twist it, his knuckles white. A small whimper escaped Leo's lips. It was a tiny sound, almost lost in the storm, but in the suffocating tension of the room, it was like a gunshot. The knife-wielding bandit stopped twisting her finger. His head snapped down, his cold eyes locking onto the small boy cowering behind his mother's legs. A nasty sneer spread across his face. "What's the matter, kid?" he taunted. "Gonna cry for your daddy? He can't hear you." Leo peeked out from behind Elena's leg, his big, terrified eyes fixing on the man's cruel face. He wasn't crying. He was staring. And in that stare there was a spark of something that wasn't fear. It was a child's pure, undiluted defiance. He shook his head, a tiny, silent act of rebellion. The bandit's sneer faltered. He hated that look. He hated being looked at like that by anyone, let alone a tiny, helpless child. It was a look of judgment. His temper, already frayed, snapped. "You looking at me?" he snarled, taking a menacing step forward. Elena felt the shift in the air. This was no longer about robbery. It was about power. About cruelty for its own sake. She instinctively shoved Leo further behind her, trying to shield him with her body. "Don't you touch him!" she cried out, her voice raw. "Or what?" The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You gonna call your husband?" He lunged, not at her but around her, his hand reaching for Leo. Elena screamed and threw herself sideways, intercepting him. He shoved her hard, sending her stumbling back against the wall. Her head hit the plaster with a dull thud. For a second, the room swam in a haze of black spots. The man now had a clear path to the boy. Leo stood alone, exposed, his small chest heaving. The bandit raised his hand, the flat of his palm open and ready to strike, to wipe that defiant look off the child's face. He wanted to see him cry. He wanted to hear him beg. Time seemed to stretch, to warp. Elena saw the hand arc through the air in agonizing slow motion. She saw the grimace of satisfaction on the man's face. She saw her son's eyes widen, not in fear now, but in sheer, uncomprehending terror. Her own throat was tight, choked with a scream that wouldn't come out. But Leo's did. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't a sob. It was a sound that didn't seem possible from such a small body. It was a high, piercing, crystalline shriek of pure, primal terror. A sound that tore through the fabric of the night. It cut through the howling wind, through the drumming rain, through the very walls of the house. It was the sound of a soul being ripped apart, a sound of absolute violation. It was so loud, so pure in its agony, that for a single, impossible moment, it drowned out the thunder itself. The bandit froze, his hand hovering inches from the boy's face, shocked by the sheer force of the sound. The leader, halfway to pocketing Elena's earrings, stopped dead. Even the man upstairs, rummaging through the safe, paused. The scream went on and on, a single sustained note of horror that vibrated in the air, in their bones, a desperate, hopeless signal fired into the heart of the storm. Miles away, in a cabin clinging to the mountainside like a stubborn scar, the old man did not sleep. Silas sat in his worn armchair in the darkness, the storm a familiar, grumbling companion. He didn't need light to see the ghosts that filled his small room, but something sliced through the familiar symphony of wind and rain. It was not a sound his ears heard, not at first. A thin needle of ice plunged directly into his heart, a vibration that resonated with a very old, very deep part of his soul, a part he had tried to bury for 30 years under solitude and silence. Then he heard it, faint, carried on a strange current of the wind, a sound that should have been impossible to hear from this distance, a child's scream, a sound that spoke a universal language of utter terror. At his feet, Ghost, the great black beast, was already on his paws. The fur on his back stood up in a rigid, sharp line. A low, guttural growl rumbled deep in his chest, a sound like shifting tectonic plates. His yellow eyes were fixed on the door, staring into the storm as if he could see the source of that terrible sound. Silas opened his eyes. The tired, haunted look of a lonely hermit was gone. In its place was something else, something hard and cold and focused. The deep lines on his face seemed to etch themselves into a mask of grim purpose. The fire wasn't in his eyes. The fire was his eyes, an old banked furnace, its door kicked open, now roaring back to life. He rose from the chair, not like an old man with aching joints, but with a fluid, economical motion that spoke of forgotten disciplines. Every movement was precise. There was no hesitation, no thought, only a cold, clear instinct. The instinct of a protector, long dormant, now awake and screaming for release. His eyes scanned the dark room, landing on an old, leather-wrapped object leaning in the corner, behind the wood stove. He walked to it, his limp barely noticeable. His scarred hands that could carve a bird from a block of wood with delicate grace, unwrapped the oil-stained leather. Inside was a tomahawk. It wasn't decorative. The hickory handle was dark with age and sweat, worn smooth by a grip that had known it intimately. The steel head was a simple, brutal design, its edge honed to a razor sharpness, its spike retaining a wicked point. It was an old friend from a different life, a tool of war. He picked it up. The weight felt familiar in his palm, a grim extension of his own arm. Ghost, sensing the shift in his master, let out a howl. It was not the lonely call of a wolf. It was a war cry, an answer to the scream that had summoned them. It was a promise, hurled into the teeth of the storm. Silas moved to the heavy oak door. He did not grab a coat. The rain did not matter. The cold did not matter. He pulled the door open, and the wind and rain exploded into the cabin, sending papers and embers flying. He stood for a moment on the threshold, a massive silhouette against the raging storm. Lightning split the sky behind him, illuminating the mountain, the trees, and the two figures of righteous fury poised to descend into the valley. The old man and his beast, ready for war. The shriek eviscerated the silence. For a moment, even the storm held its breath. The bandit with the knife, his hand still raised, recoiled as if burned. The leader, who was just turning from the stairs, froze with a look of pure annoyance. They were predators, but this sound was wrong. It was too pure, too primal. It was a sound that called things from the dark. And something answered. It wasn't a knock. It wasn't the sound of a door being kicked in. It was a sound of fundamental violation, as if the universe itself had just been torn. A deafening crack that was not thunder, followed by the percussive explosion of splintering wood. The entire front door, frame and all, blew inwards as if hit by a cannonball. It flew across the living room, trailing plaster dust and shattered hinges, and crashed into the far wall with a final, shuddering boom. Framed in the gaping hole where the entrance to their perfect home used to be, stood a silhouette. Rain and wind billowed in around him, whipping curtains and extinguishing the few remaining candles, plunging the room into a chaos of shadows. Then, a fork of lightning split the sky, backlighting the figure for one terrifying, biblical moment. It was the old man from next door, Silas. But it wasn't the hunched, quiet hermit they had seen before. This was something else entirely. He stood impossibly tall, his scarred face a mask of cold fury carved from stone. Water streamed from his gray hair, plastering it to his skull. In one hand he held a dark, wicked-looking tomahawk that seemed to drink the meager light. And at his side a second, lower silhouette materialized. Two burning yellow embers ignited in the darkness, followed by a low growl that was the sound of the earth's core churning. Ghost. The bandits were paralyzed for a half-second. A half-second of disbelief. What was this? Some crazy old man and his dog? The leader was the first to recover, a cruel laugh catching in his throat. Well, look what the storm blew in, he sneered, raising his pistol. You're a little old to play hero, Grampy. He never finished the word. Ghost did not run. He launched. A 150-pound projectile of black fur and fury, he cleared the 10 feet between the doorway and the leader in a silent, fluid blur. Time seemed to warp, stretching out into a slow-motion ballet of violence. Elena saw the leader's eyes widen, the sneer of contempt replaced by a flash of genuine terror. She saw the beast in midair, jaws agape, a cavern of white teeth and black gums. The impact wasn't a tackle, it was a collision. Ghost hit the leader's chest with the force of a speeding car, and the gunshot went wild, punching a hole in the ceiling as the man was thrown backward off his feet. He landed with a sickening, wet crunch, his head bouncing off the marble floor. Ghost was on him instantly, not tearing, but pinning him, one massive paw on his throat, the deep, rumbling growl a constant promise of annihilation. The other two bandits snapped out of their shock. The one who had threatened Leo, the one with the knife, spun to face the old man. "You crazy old bastard," he screamed and lunged. Silas didn't move back. He moved forward, into the attack. The bandit's knife slashed through the air where Silas's gut should have been. But Silas was already inside his guard. His left hand shot out, not to block the knife, but to seize the wrist that held it, his scarred fingers clamping down like a vice. There was an audible crack of bone. The bandit shrieked, his hand going limp, the knife clattering to the floor. Silas didn't let go. His other hand, the one holding the tomahawk, moved with brutal efficiency. He didn't use the blade, he reversed it. The flat, weighted pole of the hatchet slammed into the side of the bandit's knee. The leg buckled with a wet, tearing sound, folding at an angle it was never meant to take. As the man crumpled, howling, Silas released his broken wrist and drove the heel of his palm into the man's nose. The crunch was sickeningly loud in the suddenly quiet room. The bandit collapsed in a heap, unconscious before he hit the ground. It had taken less than 3 seconds. From upstairs, a new sound, heavy footsteps pounding down. The third man, the one with the crowbar, had heard the commotion. He came charging down the stairs, roaring, ready to join the fight. He saw one of his partners on the floor, another pinned by a demon dog, and a silent old man standing in the center of the room. He raised the crowbar high, intending to crush Silas's skull. Silas turned, his movements fluid, unhurried. He met the man's charge not with force, but with a simple, devastating pivot. He let the man's own momentum carry him past. As the crowbar whistled by his ear, Silas hooked his arm around the man's neck, spun with him, and used the bandit's own forward velocity to hurl him headfirst over the sofa. The man flew through the air and crashed through the expensive mahogany coffee table, which exploded into a shower of splinters and shattered glass. He landed in a tangled mess of limbs and wreckage, groaning, the fight knocked completely out of him. Through it all, from behind the steel door of the panic room, Mock watched. His eye was pressed to the tiny concealed peephole he'd been so proud of. He saw it all. He saw the dirty old hobo he'd threatened, the man he'd dismissed as worthless, dismantle 3 armed criminals with the cold precision of a hurricane. He saw the beast he wanted to have put down holding the leader by the throat, and a new kind of terror gripped him. It wasn't just fear of the bandits. It was the soul-shaking fear of a coward who has just witnessed what a real man is. He slid down the door, his body trembling uncontrollably, a pathetic whimper escaping his lips. The room was suddenly still, save for the storm outside and Ghost's menacing growl. Silas stood in the center of the destruction, breathing steadily, his eyes scanning the fallen men. But he had made one mistake. He had assumed the leader was out for the count. With a surge of adrenaline, the man under Ghost's paw managed to get a hand free. He clawed at his belt, his fingers finding the handle of a combat knife sheathed there. In one desperate, violent motion, he bucked, throwing the massive dog off balance for a fraction of a second, and drove the knife upwards. Silas saw the flicker of steel. He moved instantly, but he wasn't fast enough. The blade sank deep into the muscle of his left shoulder. A sharp grunt of pain escaped Silas's lips. It was the first sound he had made. But he didn't stagger. He didn't cry out. The pain seemed only to focus him. His eyes, which had been cold fire, now became white-hot novas. Ignoring the knife protruding from his shoulder, he strode forward. The bandit leader scrambled to his feet, a wild, terrified grin on his face. "Not so tough now, are you, old man?" Silas answered without words. He closed the distance in 2 long strides. The bandit slashed with the knife again, a wild, clumsy arc. Silas ducked under it, his own tomahawk a blur. He didn't aim for the head or the chest. He swung the sharp, bearded edge of the axe blade directly into the man's knife hand. The leader screamed, a raw, high-pitched sound of pure agony as the tomahawk bit deep into flesh and bone, severing tendons. His hand, still clutching his knife, fell uselessly to his side, attached by little more than skin. Silas kicked the man's feet out from under him. As he fell backward, Silas stepped on the man's chest, pinning him to the floor. He leaned down, his face inches from the bandits, the rain and blood dripping from his hair onto the man's terrified face. For the first time, Silas spoke. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. "You touched the child." He raised the tomahawk. Not the blade, not the spike. He raised the heavy, flat pole high and brought it down with final, absolute authority. There was a dull, heavy thud. And then, silence. A profound silence where the only sound was the drumming of the rain, the whimpering of a coward behind a steel door, and the ragged, pained breathing of a savior with a knife in his shoulder. Silas stood there for a long moment, a wounded giant amidst the wreckage, his chest heaving. The storm inside had passed. He turned, his gaze falling upon Elena and Leo, who were still huddled on the stairs, staring at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. The terrifying warrior was gone. In his place was just an old, tired, bleeding man. He looked at them, and for the first time, Elena saw not a monster or a psycho, but an ocean of sorrow in his eyes. He had saved them. But she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that he was reliving a night long ago when he hadn't. The world resolved itself into a series of broken pieces. The shattered coffee table, the overturned sofa, the limp, sprawling forms of the bandits lying like discarded puppets. The only sounds were the steady drumming of rain on the roof, the low, threatening growl still vibrating in Ghost's chest, and the ragged, shallow breaths of Elena, who was still clutching Leo on the bottom stair. The boy wasn't crying. He was just staring, his small face a mask of awe, at the giant of a man who stood in the center of their ruined home. Silas stood for a long moment, the tomahawk dripping in his hand, his chest heaving. The storm of violence that had possessed him was receding, leaving behind a profound and ancient weariness. The knife in his shoulder was a hot, searing spike of pain, and a dark, wet patch was spreading rapidly across his flannel shirt. He finally let the tomahawk fall from his numb fingers. It hit the marble floor with a dull, heavy clank. He turned, his eyes finding Elena and Leo. The fury was gone, replaced by a vast, hollow emptiness that seemed to swallow the light. He saw their fear. He had always seen it in people's eyes. He took a half step back, as if to retreat into the storm he'd come from, to remove the monster from their sight. But Leo wriggled free from his mother's grasp. "Mister!" The boy's small voice cut through the tension. "You're bleeding." Elena gasped, reaching for him, but Leo took a tentative step forward. He pointed a small finger at Silas's shoulder. He wasn't afraid of the scars, the blood, or the wreckage. He only saw the man who had carved him the wooden wolf, the man whose dog licked his hand. That simple, innocent observation broke the spell. Elena looked past the terrifying warrior and saw what her son saw, a wounded man. A man who had just bled to save them. A tidal wave of shame, gratitude, and a fierce, protective instinct washed over her. She scrambled to her feet, pulling Leah back gently behind her. "Stay here, sweetie," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just for a second." She moved across the room, her steps unsure at first, then gaining purpose. She navigated the debris, her eyes fixed on the dark stain on Silas's shirt. You need to sit down," she said, her voice barely audible. "Let me see." Silas didn't answer. He just watched her approach, his expression unreadable. He seemed like a mountain, immovable and impervious, but she saw the slight tremor in his hand, the gray pallor beneath his weathered skin. He was in shock. He swayed slightly, and she lunged forward, not out of fear, but to steady him, her small hands pressing against his uninjured arm. The muscle beneath his sleeve was like granite. "Please," she insisted, her voice stronger now. She guided him to the one remaining armchair that wasn't overturned or broken. He sank into it heavily, a low grunt of pain escaping his lips as his wounded shoulder jostled. Ghost, seeing his master was being cared for, finally released the unconscious leader, padding silently to Silas's side and resting his massive head on the old man's knee, a low whine in his throat. "I have a first aid kit," Elena said, more to herself than to him. She ran to the kitchen, her mind a frantic blur. She returned a moment later with a white plastic box, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the clasps. She knelt before him, the antiseptic smell of wipes filling the air. "This is going to hurt," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the brutal gash. The handle of the knife protruded obscenely from the thick muscle of his deltoid. I can't pull it out. We have to wait. But I can clean around it. Stop some of the bleeding." He gave a slow, deliberate nod, his eyes closed. He was somewhere else, his mind far away from this room. Elena took a deep, steadying breath and began to work. She gently cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt with a pair of small scissors from the kit. As she leaned in close, concentrating, the chain around her neck swung forward. A small, old-fashioned silver locket dangled from it, tarnished with age. It swayed like a pendulum, catching the dim light. Silas's eyes snapped open. They weren't focused on her face, or her trembling hands, or the wound. They were locked onto the locket. It was a simple, oval piece of silver, etched with a single, faded rose. He'd know it anywhere. He had held it 1,000 times. He had bought it at a dusty antique store on a sunny Tuesday 30 years ago. His hand, the one that wasn't trembling, shot out. It wasn't a violent move, but it was so sudden, so urgent, that Elena flinched back. His calloused, scarred fingers didn't touch her skin. They wrapped around the silver oval with a reverence that was terrifying in its intensity. He held it in his palm as if it were a living, breathing thing. His knuckles were white. "Where?" he rasped, his voice a raw, broken thing, like stones grinding together. "Where'd you get this?" Elena stared at him, bewildered. Her heart was pounding. It was my mother's," she stammered. "She gave it to me before she passed away. It was from my father." Silas's gaze lifted from the locket to her face, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He saw past the terrified woman, past the neighbor. He saw the shape of her eyes, the gentle curve of her jaw, the way a strand of dark hair fell across her forehead. He saw a ghost. "Your father," he said, the words catching in his throat, thick with decades of unshed grief. A tear slid down Elena's cheek, a tear for a man she'd never known. "He disappeared. Before I was born. My mother always said, she said he was a soldier, that he died a hero, on a mission so secret they could never even send his body home. It was a story she had recited her whole life, a myth she had built her identity upon." Silas did not seem to hear the end of her sentence. His eyes were glassy, looking through her, into a past that was suddenly, brutally present. With his free hand, he reached into the collar of his torn shirt. The movement was slow, agonizing. His fingers fumbled, pulling out a greasy leather cord from which hung a small, stitched leather pouch. The pouch was worn nearly smooth with time and touch. With painstaking effort, he untied the knot and tipped the contents into his blood-stained palm. It was a photograph, folded and refolded so many times the creases were like canyons. It was faded, yellowed, and soft as old cloth. He unfolded it carefully. It was a picture of a young man with his arm around a laughing young woman. The man was him, 30 years younger, his face not yet a road map of scars and sorrow, his eyes bright with life. The woman was beautiful, her head thrown back in a joyous laugh. But the photograph was torn. A jagged, uneven edge ran right down the middle, separating the couple from whatever or whoever was on the other side. Silas laid the torn photograph on his knee. Then, with a hand that shook like a leaf in a gale, he reached for the locket still clutched in his other hand. His thumb found the tiny hidden clasp. He pressed it. The locket sprang open. Inside, nestled in the velvet lining, were 2 miniature portraits. On one side, a tiny, faded image of a baby, Elena. On the other, another photograph, this one cut into a perfect oval. It was the other half of the picture. It was the laughing woman from his photo, her arm linked with his, her face tilted towards the man who was no longer there. His own disembodied arm was still wrapped around her shoulder in the tiny image. He took his torn photograph and laid its jagged edge against the locket. They matched. Perfectly. The tear in his photo aligned precisely with the cutout shape in hers. Two halves of a single stolen moment. The room fell away. The storm, the sirens now wailing faintly in the distance, the bodies on the floor. It all vanished. There was only the face of his wife Sarah laughing in the sun, and the face of this woman, her daughter, staring at him, her eyes wide with a dawning, impossible understanding. Sarah, Silas whispered the name like a prayer he had forgotten how to speak. He looked up at Elena, and the dam of a 30-year-old agony finally broke. A single hot tear carved a clean path through the grime and blood on his cheek. "My father's name," Elena whispered, her whole body trembling. It was Silas. He could only nod, the movement stiff, choked. He looked at her, his daughter, the child he never knew he had, the living legacy of the woman he had lost. The reason he had hidden himself away from the world, consumed by a shame so profound it had become his very soul. The wail of the sirens grew louder, closer. Red and blue lights began to pulse against the shattered windows, painting the scene of destruction in frantic, strobing colors. The world was rushing back in. But for Silas and Elena, kneeling amidst the ruins, time was standing still. A father and a daughter, separated by a lifetime of lies and tragedy, had finally found each other in the heart of a storm. The flashing red and blue lights painted the ruined living room in frantic, strobing bursts of color. They slashed across the faces of Silas and Elena, two figures frozen in the eye of a hurricane of revelation. The air, thick with the smell of rain and blood, now crackled with the impossible truth that hung between them. The sirens wailed, growing louder, closer, but in that moment they were a distant, meaningless noise. The world had shrunk to the space between a father's torn photograph and a daughter's locket. Elena's fingers trembled as she touched the edge of the photo on Silas's knee, tracing the jagged line where it met the locket in his other hand. It was real. This mountain of a man, this scarred recluse who lived with a beast, this terrifying angel who had descended from the storm to save them. He was the ghost she had spent her life trying to imagine.
"My mother,"
Elena whispered, her voice breaking.
"She said you were gone."
She said the government told her you were lost. Presumed dead on a covert operation. She never stopped loving you. She never took this locket off until the day she gave it to me. A lifetime of pain, of guilt, of self-imposed exile warred across Silas's face. He had been a government operative, a man sent into the darkest corners of the world. When a mission went sideways, they had left him for dead, his own people. He had survived, but he returned a broken man, disavowed and dishonored, with a face so mangled he couldn't bear the thought of his wife seeing the monster he'd become. He had chosen to remain a ghost, believing it was a kindness to let her mourn a hero rather than live with a ruin. He had been wrong. For 30 years he had been punishing himself and her and this child he never knew existed. "I didn't die," he rasped, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. "I just stopped living." Before Elena could answer, the splintered front door was kicked wide open. Two police officers burst in, weapons raised, their eyes wide as they took in the carnage. "Police! Nobody move!" one shouted, his voice echoing in the sudden silence. They saw the three unconscious bandits, the blood, the wreckage. They saw the giant scarred man sitting in a chair, a knife handle protruding from his shoulder, and a massive black dog growling low at his side. They saw the pale woman and the small child. Confusion clouded their faces. Elena shot to her feet, placing herself between the officers and Silas. "Don't shoot," she cried out, her voice ringing with newfound strength. "He saved us," these men broke in. "They were going to. He saved our lives." The officers slowly lowered their weapons as paramedics rushed in behind them, their eyes assessing the scene with professional calm. One medic immediately moved toward Silas. "Sir, we need to look at that shoulder." It was then, amidst the controlled chaos of uniforms and medical kits, that another sound was heard. A soft click. The bathroom door, which had remained shut through the entire ordeal, creaked open. Mark's head appeared first, his eyes darting around the room like a frightened mouse. He saw the police, the paramedics tending to Silas, the subdued bandits. He saw that the danger had passed. A calculated transformation began to take place. He straightened his designer shirt, attempting to smooth the wrinkles of his terror. He ran a shaky hand through his perfectly coiffed hair and stepped out, forcing an air of exhausted relief. He strode toward the center of the room, deliberately positioning himself in the officer's line of sight. He clapped his hands together once, a hollow, theatrical sound. "Well," he announced, his voice trembling slightly but dripping with false bravado, "that was a close one. We sure showed them, didn't we?" He looked at Silas, a pathetic, conspiratorial grin plastered on his face. "Good work, old man. We make a hell of a team." He took a step closer and made the mistake of trying to pat Silas on his good shoulder. Ghost growl deepened into a sound like rocks grinding in the belly of the earth. But it was Elena who moved. She turned to face her husband. The look on her face was not one of sadness or fear. It was a glacial calm, a terrifying stillness that preceded an avalanche. Every person in the room, the cops, the paramedics, even Silas, felt the temperature drop. "We?" she repeated, her voice so quiet it was more chilling than a scream. "There was no we, Mark." Mark's smile faltered. He took a half step back. "Now, honey, I was creating a distraction, a tactical retreat. You wouldn't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," she said, taking a slow, deliberate step towards him. The room became a stage, and they were the only actors. "I understand that when those men came in, you didn't stand in front of your son. You stood behind him." She took another step. "I understand that you fell to your knees and begged for your own life. And I understand," her voice dropped to a venomous whisper, "that you pointed at me, you pointed at your wife, and you told them, 'Take her, just don't hurt me.'" Mark's face went white. He opened his mouth to deny it, to spin another lie, but he never got the chance. Elena's hand moved in a blur. The sound of the slap was like a gunshot in a silent room, a sharp, cracking report that echoed off the marble floors. A bright red handprint bloomed on Mark's cheek, a brand of his cowardice. He staggered back, his eyes wide with shock and humiliation. "We are done," Elena said, each word a chisel chipping away at the foundation of their life. "This marriage is over. You will not see Leo. You will not speak my name. You are nothing to us." She turned her back on him, a final, complete dismissal. Mark sputtered, clutching his cheek. "You can't do this. I'll take everything. The house, the money, the boy. You'll have nothing. Sir, is this your phone?" The calm voice of a police officer cut through Mark's tirade. The officer was holding up Mark's gold-plated smartphone, which had fallen near the bathroom door. The screen was illuminated. It seems to have been receiving a lot of urgent messages from a Mr. Alistair Finch. Something about moving offshore assets before the federal investigators freeze them? Mark froze. The last vestiges of color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray. He looked from the phone to the officer's impassive expression. In that moment, he wasn't just a coward who had lost his family. He was a criminal who had just been caught. That's a misunderstanding," he stammered, but the lie died on his lips. The game was over. As the officer took him by the arm and murmured something about coming down to the station, Mark's entire world, built on brand names and bluster, collapsed into a pile of ash. Elena didn't watch them lead him away. Her attention was already back where it belonged. She turned and knelt beside Silas's chair as the paramedic carefully worked on his shoulder. She reached out and took his large, calloused hand. It was the hand of a warrior, a woodcarver, a survivor. It was her father's hand. He squeezed back, a silent promise passing between them. A new family, born from the wreckage of a storm. 6 months later, the sun was setting over the mountain, bathing the valley in a warm, golden light. The air was crisp and clean. The ugly, spiteful fence that had separated the two properties was gone. In its place, a winding path of smooth river stones meandered through a garden of wildflowers, connecting a small, rustic cabin to a modern, inviting home. The two houses were no longer neighbors. They were part of a single, sprawling whole. On the lawn, a sound of pure joy rang out. Leo, now 6 years old, was laughing as he rode on the broad, black back of Ghost. The massive beast trotted gently, his tail wagging slowly, his demeanor that of a patient, loving guardian rather than a hellhound. On the porch of the cabin, in a newly built rocking chair, sat Silas. The scars on his face remained, a permanent map of his past, but they were no longer framed by a mask of sorrow. The deep lines around his eyes crinkled as he watched his grandson play. His shoulder had healed, leaving another scar to add to his collection. But this one felt different. It was a mark of redemption. He was carving a small, intricate figure of a bear, his hands moving with a fluid grace that belied their strength. The cabin door opened, and Elena emerged carrying a tray with 3 tall glasses of iced tea. She wore a simple summer dress, and her face was relaxed, her smile easy and genuine. She was no longer a shadow in her own home. She was its light. She handed a glass to Silas and sat in the rocking chair beside him, settling into a comfortable, familiar silence. They sat together, the 3 of them, a grandfather, a mother, and a son, a family forged in violence and healed by love. They watched the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the peaks. Silas looked from the laughing boy on the back of his dog to the peaceful face of the daughter he never knew he had. He had spent 30 years believing he was a monster, hiding from the world in the shadows of a mountain. But he had been wrong. The real beast isn't the one covered in scars, or the one with sharp teeth and a loud growl. The real beast is the one who looks human but betrays its own. And the real hero is the one who, after a lifetime in the dark, finally finds his way back home.